Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Today is February 9th. As per usual, we always start with our mandate and the statement of purpose and value, so I'll read those out. The Standing Committee on Public Accounts is charged with matters concerning the public accounts of the province, the annual report of the Auditor General, and fiscal management. The Standing Committee on Public Accounts is dedicated to improving public administration in partnership with the Auditor General. The committee examines the administration of government policy, not the merits of it. The committee strives to achieve consensus on its decisions whenever possible. Members take a nonpartisan approach to the work of the committee. So I'll call the meeting to order, and I'd like to welcome everybody here. So we've got Robert Henderson, Sydney McEwen, Corey Deagle, Gord Henderson, sorry about that, and Carla Bernard. And joining us, we also have the Honourable Peter Bevan Baker. So welcome to the members, and I will ask for an adoption, somebody to approve the adoption of the agenda. Sydney, thank you. And today we're going to be talking about procurement. We have guests with us today. We have Lori Richard, Acting Manager of Procurement Services with the Department of Finance, and we have Cal Whitnell, Executive Director of Economic and Population Growth, Department of Economic Growth, Tourism and Culture. And they have a presentation that they'll go through, and would you prefer that we just wait until the end of the presentation to ask questions and then we'll open it up?
Sure.
Okay, if that's okay with the committee, then we will proceed. Thank you very much for being with us, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the invite here to talk about our new Procurement of Goods Act and regulations and how it affects our tendering process. My name is Lori Richard, and I'm the Acting Manager of Procurement Services.
Hi, thanks for the invite. Look forward to the discussion. I'm Cal Whitnell, Director of Economic and Population Growth at the Department of Economic Growth, Tourism and Culture. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a short slideshow to go through. Okay, so first we'll give a procurement services overview, who we are, what we look like, our mandate, and our mission statement. Who we are, we're Procurement Services. We're a division under the Controller's Office within the Department of Finance. Our mission statement is defined by the following three factors. We procure in a timely manner at the lowest practical cost and to conform with our Act regulations, Treasury Board policies, and trade obligations. Our strategic goals are as follows: to procure as effectively as possible in an open, fair, and competitive environment, to provide knowledge and advice to all government entities, to procure or to ensure lowest cost is obtained when possible, to provide continuous training and education to all department entities, and to maintain ethical business standards and full legal compliance while procuring. Who are we? Well, we are a very small team. I myself am the manager. We have two procurement officers, and we have a procurement assistant. So how do we look? We look somewhat decentralized. Having said that, not all tenders come through our office. Construction tenders filter through TI, and Health PEI have their own procurement team and look after their own procurement. Okay. Having said that, we do provide guidance to all crowns and departments when we are asked. So we'll talk a little bit about the tendering process. So as you see, the initial requirements. So first of all, the entity identifies what they need to procure. Then the entity begins communications with procurement services to discuss what their need may be, their value, their timeline, and their additional specs. Depending on the value of procurement services, depending on the value of what they need to procure, procurement services will determine the proper process to follow. And then the subject matter expert within the department or the entity, being the Crown or Crown, will develop the specs. Okay? So once in development of the specifications, procurement services will assist in developing, and we will determine key factors that an entity may want to take into consideration, being timeline, closing date, submission method, and evaluation. So now we would be at the stage of posting our tender. So the tenders will be posted to our website, all public tenders. If it is an invited tender, it is sent out to the local vendors through our procurement services email. So tender submissions, compliant bids after the closing date, compliant bids would be forwarded to the entity for evaluation. So the award and the purchase decision then, recommendations from the entity are sent to procurement services. Then there's given the approval and the award process to follow. So we'll talk about the scope of our new act. The new Procurement of Goods Act and regulations came into force on November the 15th, 2020. It replaces the Public Purchasing Act, and this act is for goods only. And the key difference within this act is it applies to Schedules A and B, whereas the Public Purchasing Act only had one schedule. Okay? So the new act applies to all government departments, crowns, and including school boards. The previous act only referred to departments. Okay? This act includes Schedules A and B in order to involve all entities under the FAA to conform with standard purchasing rules and regulations across government. This will also align purchasing thresholds with our neighboring provinces. So some key changes to our regulations, which are directed by our Act. It's a broader scope, which I had talked about. It includes departments, crown corporations, wherein the regulations are referred to as entities. Okay, if you read the regulations, it refers to entity A or entity B, which determines if it's a department or a crown. Thresholds have been increased, and they've been revised on a jurisdictional scan to better align our provinces, to better align with other provinces and trade obligations, such as the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and Cal will speak to that in a further slide. Okay. We've also added a local preference clause. It's a new clause for up to 10% of the tender criteria may be applied to support local businesses. Now I'll show a sample of that in a later slideshow. Okay. So this slide shows you the previous thresholds, okay, under the old regulations, and the new thresholds under the current regulations. So Schedule A refers to a department. Schedule B refers to Crown and school boards. So as you can see on the screen, we can talk about the new thresholds. As you see, is 0 to 4,999. The procurement may be directed, invited, or public. 5,000 to 999. We can receive 2 quotes. It can be invited or a public procurement. 10,000 to 26,400. It can be an invited, limited to local, or public procurement. Okay, so those are the tools that we may use when we decide what type of procurement we're going to use. So in Schedule B, as you'll see, previously each crown had their own internal policies. But now the new thresholds are between 0 and 249,999. They may direct procure, have an invited procurement, or a public procurement, or perform one of those 3 tools. Anything, so then 250,000 to 528,300. As you can see, it can be a limited procurement to local or a public procurement tool used. Okay. So you will see the 26.4 is, and the 528.3 reference our lowest applicable trade agreement, which is the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. So anything over those values has to be publicly procured. Okay. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about our local preference clause / treatment. So local pricing preference clause may be used up to 10%, but there's no obligation, okay? Neither entity have to use this obligation or have to use this percentage. Or preferential treatment, I should say. It may be applied to local bids when using an invited or public tendering process. So this would be used an example when an off-island company would submit a bid, okay? It only be applied when tenders are below the lowest applicable trade agreement. And as I alluded to before, the threshold levels within departments is 26.4, according to the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and 528,300, 4 crowns. So the local preference option and percentage must be determined and outlined prior to posting a tender. So we must notify, so that it has to be in the tender document if we're going to use the preferential treatment and what percentage, okay? We don't have to use 10, it could be 5, it depends on what the entity decides to use. So we just have an example here, and we just use the crowns just as an example. So if you see the local bid, as an example, of a local bid come in at 200,000, the non-local bid is 195. If we have told on the onset that we were going to use the percentage, okay, let's say in this example it's 10%. So you'll see that it reduces the local bid to 180,000, where the non-local bid stays 195. So the local bid would win, but you are obligated to pay what the original bid was, which would be 200,000. Okay. Cal, do you have anything you want to add to that, as far as local preference or?
Thanks, Laura. And also, just important point about this slide is you have to reiterate that the local preference can only be utilized under threshold. It can't be utilized over the thresholds that were discussed earlier, because we do have trade obligations and other agreements external to government that we have to follow. So I think that's an important distinction, that the way this policy is being developed, it's only under threshold levels, specific threshold levels. So we maybe look at the next slide. And just in terms of the considerations, and it talked about the development of this policy and the local preference policy, our division did work very closely with Lori and the procurement services, and we obviously did a broad scan and looked at all the internal policies, the public purchasing policy, which was existent, the Treasury Board policies and guidelines as well. And then moving out from that in terms of some of our external obligations and commitments as well, we do have to take into account the domestic and the international trade obligations, and kind of working out from a regional perspective. We used to have the Atlantic Procurement Agreement, but that was replaced in 2020 last year by the Atlantic Trade and Procurement Partnership MOU, which is now in existence. You can find that online, and that came into force. There was one that came out in January of 2020, but then there was a recent amendment to that agreement and was posted on the Council of Atlantic Premier's site in August of 2020. So there's no specific trade negotiation or trade obligations within the region anymore, at least the Atlantic region. That is an MOU only, with the provinces, the 4 provinces, working together closely on trade issues and procurement issues as well. And from that perspective, we also have to look at the international trade obligations we have for procurement obligations, which there are many. We have the Canada-European Union CETA agreement, which came into force in 2017. We have the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which came into force in 2018. We also have a World Trade Organization Government Procurement Agreement, which we have obligations for internationally. And then obviously we can't forget about the domestic agreement, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement as well, which right now those are the lowest thresholds that we currently have obligations for tendering for the province. And when we have to actually publicly make it available to, at a minimum, other Canadian companies to bid on our tenders. So as we were going through this process, there were a number of factors that we were looking at in terms of local preference. Obviously, COVID response and economic recovery is an important topic these days, and how can we drive business and recovery for small business within the province. We looked at that, and we looking at supporting business locally. We also wanted to make sure we do have retained policy flexibility in a number of areas within our trade obligations, both domestically and internationally. We took those exceptions or policy flexibilities into account. And we also did a jurisdictional scan. We did speak with a number of the other provinces, both within the region, the Atlantic region, and across the country. And a number of provinces are looking at local preference clauses or local procurement strategies, and a number of them have adopted or are in the process of adopting new local preference clauses similar to what we've adopted here. And keeping in mind, though, that all jurisdictions are following their trade commitments and obligations. Hence, that's why you see the local preference clause being applied under certain threshold levels. So we did go do a comprehensive review and the development of these policies moving forward. So that hopefully gives you a good snapshot of where we're at with procurement and tendering. Thank you.
And that's all we have for presentation.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
questions?
Members, I'll open it up for questions. Carla?
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank you both for coming in, and I was really pleased to see you both come in terms of having someone from the Finance Department as well as someone from Economic and Population Growth, because we know that these two things should be very tightly woven. And so it shows me that there is an understanding that those are really interconnected, and that if we look across at jurisdictional scans, we see lots of examples of relationships like that we understand they're not stagnant, that they are forever growing, because we can get better, and we always should be aiming at getting better. So I'm curious how you see the connection between your two offices continuing. Where do you see that evolving to? What are you working on?
What was it? Okay, so Cal and I do work very closely together when it comes to procurement. We work closely together if I have a question from an entity, okay, that may fall within the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. So I use him as a resource quite often, so that we do lead entities in the proper way. How do we work together? We're trying to work together to make procurement regulations better for our province and our local businesses.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair. Pardon me?
Continuing to see what we can change going forward.
Okay, Carla?
So one of the things that we see across jurisdictions often is that they're starting to remove procurement from the minister's grasp. I'll use that term, because they see that potentially where the minister can be involved, that's not best practice necessarily in terms, this is an area where we want to ensure transparency and accountability. I would argue one of the highest places that we need to see that. So how did it come to be settled on this particular act? Let me rephrase it. What jurisdictions have a similar act and regulations?
What I can speak to in that is we, as you know, as the Procurement of Goods Act, I do know that other neighboring provinces, their act includes services and goods. But my understanding, it was decided at the time to move forward with goods within our act at this point. I know in developing the regulations for the Act, there was some discussion, perhaps maybe looking at services as a phase 2, perhaps for government moving forward. As far as a timeline, I know it was just preliminary discussions. I'm not really sure a timeline of when that might move forward.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair. So where are services covered at the moment?
Sure. Okay, so services are covered under our Treasury Board policies. So Treasury Board produces the policies and procedures for services, and we instruct Crowns or entities and to follow those policies. We do not create the policies for services, it's Treasury Board.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair. So I'm just wondering, what do you see are the major changes on PEI now with the implementation of, and how we're going to conduct public procurement under the new law and regulations?
Well, our hope would be that we'll support our local businesses, right, with the changes made to our regulations, with increasing our thresholds. Prior to, our threshold for purchasing was $5,000, for publicly tendering was $5,000, which was pretty low. I'm happy to have that increase to align with other provinces, hoping that that will support more local procurement contracts for goods.
Thank you, Chair. I'll
Carol?
ask one more.
Sure.
And then you can move on and come back to me. So I'm happy to hear you say support local. And I did a quick search in the document for the word local, and it came up one time. So I know in many other jurisdictions, part of what they do is they have a checklist, and they do environmental assessments, and they do look at exactly what it means to support local. How do you do that? How do you optimize that? How do you keep your that framework? And it's very specific checklists that they use every single time. And I don't see anything like that in this, in the regulations. Am I missing something?
No, we do not have a checklist within our regulations, no. If that's what you're asking, no, we don't have that. But we do have a buy local. Do you want to speak to that?
There's a definition of what local supplier is, and that's someone that has a place of business within the province is the definition. A pretty broad definition, but as long as you conduct business here, you're considered to be local. And that local preference clause could apply in those situations.
Okay. Did you have a follow-up to that, or did you want to?
Well, I think,
go ahead, Caroline.
sorry, Chair, I think, not necessarily a question, but a comment. I feel like there's something that, might have been a bit of a miss in the new regulations, because that, if there's nothing there, if there's no checklist there for us to follow, how do we ensure that we're following proper process at all times? And where's the accountability piece? So I'll leave it for now and come back. Thank you, Chair.
Robbie?
Yeah, thanks for your information and presentation there. Just a couple of small things here. One, you'd mentioned a comment about the lowest practical cost. Maybe you could define a bit more what that means, because if I think about things, like I can go buy a chainsaw or a whippersnipper as an example, and I can get quite a range of the price ranges in that, and quality is a big issue, where, let's say, where it was manufactured, the name of the company and things of that nature, whether it's a professional grade or not. So I'm just trying to define how that would apply to a lowest practical cost. Like I say, if you went and ordered a whippersnipper, I can get them really cheap, and that's the lowest practical price, but it may be a piece of junk too.
So, like I said earlier, when the department or the entity determines what they need to purchase, it's the expert within the department that would put the tender specs together that would refer to that good. And so we would, in our tender, we say equal or better than, okay? So it must be equal to the spec or better than, okay? So then what we do is we look at the cost.
Rob?
So do they make a recommendation on a brand, or is it, or they just take the brand and use the spec of that brand, and there's really not a lot of choice in the matter?
So the entity will determine what their needs are, okay? So if they may need a X brand or a B brand, depending on what they need what they need to perform, what service they need to perform, it's left up to the department to determine the brand quality. And so then if a vendor meets all of the requirements, then it could be a vendor A and a vendor B have the same type. Whomever has the best price would win the tender.
Rob?
Okay, another question I sort of had, and it comes back to price versus value, and I'll use some examples. In my district right now, we have 2 suppliers of sand on the roads, and one seems to be, it's a different sand somehow. Now, and I check with the department and the complaints and things of that nature. They say, no, it all meets the spec. Yeah, well, I'm not saying what the problem is, but it like I say, it just doesn't seem to be the same stuff, and it seems to be, I get a pile of complaints about it. So how do you determine that when it comes to, now that those things were tendered, and that company got the tender, and they were the lowest bid, and I respect all of that, it's different sand somehow.
Well, I guess my response to that is in procurement, we're not the commodity expert, right? We leave that within the department and the experts, the engineers or whomever I'll say with TI to determine if it meets their spec requirements or not. We are here in procurement service to lead the process and to ensure that it's fair and open and transparent. Now, the department would determine whether or not that was an equal brand.
Rob?
Okay, anyway, I guess that's probably all I have, just to, like say, really, it's really more the department's really determining this, not so much, you're just making sure that the process complies with your act, that's about it, right? Yeah.
Peter?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Laurie and Cal, for being here this morning. I want to start by asking a couple of questions following from some of the things Carla asked regarding the fact that this is the Procurement of Goods Act rather than the Procurement of Goods and Services Act. And you did reference that a little bit, Laurie, but I want to dig down a little bit on that, because many jurisdictions are in the process of improving their procurement processes. Manitoba started in 2016, and there's going to be a report this year, I believe, later this year, at the 5-year point, on this 5-year plan to improve their procurement processes, to get more in line with the OECD principles of integrity for public procurement. And seems to me that PEI is a very long way off that sort of thing. You mentioned that, and I haven't found any other jurisdiction where there's a Procurement of Goods Act which doesn't include services. So you said it was decided, and I can't quote you exactly, Laurie, but that might be part of phase 2, that services weren't going to be included. There was a decision made not to include services in this at this stage. And I'm wondering who made that decision and why they made that decision.
So what I can tell you is our act, our Goods and Service Act was in force in December 2016, and my mandate was given to move forward with the regulations. But at that time there was some light discussion, I will say. It was just mentioned about perhaps service would be our next phase. Discussion. There was many people around the table. And I move forward with the regulations as noted. And but my hopes in procurement is that the government will look on the phase 2 as services sooner than later. But I can't tell you the timeline because I don't make those decisions.
Peter?
Thanks, Laurie. I appreciate
Okay.
that. So again, going back to the Manitoba example that I just used, 5 years ago they embarked on a process to improve their procurement. The passing of this act was obviously a step forward here, and I'm wondering whether there is, as far as you're aware, any sort of long-term plan or strategy when it comes to modernizing, if I can put it that way, the procurement process here on Prince Edward Island.
We have a decentralized procurement services, as I mentioned. Other provinces have a centralized procurement services. And my thought would be, until we have an evaluation or look at perhaps becoming a centralized procurement, we just don't have the resources within our office to handle a bigger scope at this point in time. As I told you before, we're very small. So to bring services and construction, as you would say, under our umbrella, would be we would need more resources with in-house to ensure that that would roll out.
Peter?
Sounds like there's a capacity issue there, Laurie. Newfoundland has, as you probably know, an independent body that looks after procurement outside of government. And I'm wondering whether that has ever been discussed here on PEI.
To me, it has not been. It has never. I've never actually heard that that may happen. I'm not really sure. It could happen in the future. I can't really answer that question. Just because
Peter?
I don't have the answer.
Sure.
Yep. Peter?
I'm I'm going to follow up on the local, and Cal, you gave the definition, which was one of the questions flowing from what you said, and you said an entity that conducts business on Prince Edward Island. Is that the definition of local? So when I think of that, you know, a Home Depot conducts business here on Prince Edward Island, but could hardly be considered, in my mind anyway, as a local business if we're looking to procure from local suppliers. So I'm wondering, firstly, whether that definition is in line with other jurisdictions when they talk about local preference.
During the jurisdictional scan, I think we did look at what a proper definition would be, and I think the bar or the threshold that people looked at was that as long as you had a place of business, anyone that is operating here and has a presence here, and a physical presence here on the island should be able to bid on a particular tender if it goes local only. Take your point around the Home Depots of the world. We are talking about government procurement here. You have to keep in mind that anyone that does have presence here, there's jobs associated with that. There's islanders working in those locations as well. So at least initially the thought was that making sure that no one was left out of those opportunities as long as you had a place of business here on the island.
Peter?
Yeah, and I don't mean to pick on Home Depot,
No,
just
no, I
one that
understand.
came to mind,
Yeah.
that's all. You mentioned that the Atlantic procurement agreement was changed or replaced with something last year, I believe
Yes.
it was. Would this local preference have been possible prior with the previous Atlantic procurement agreement in place?
It would be possible, but the threshold levels would even be lower.
Yeah.
So the threshold levels actually were down to $10,000 under the Atlantic procurement agreement.
And 50 for services, right?
Yes, correct. So it would have been possible, but at a much lower level. The reason we looked at the Atlantic Trade and Procurement Partnership, MOU, as a replacement, we looked at various options on how we should proceed with the Atlantic Procurement Agreement. We came up with 3 or 4 different options and a recommendation, and it was thought that based on the Canadian Free Trade Agreement negotiations and the comprehensiveness of the coverage and what all provinces, territories, and the federal government had put forward, that there wasn't much room left, if any, to improve on or provide additional access or opportunities beyond the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. So there really wasn't much more room for negotiations, so hence we looked at an MOU structure with no specific procurement obligations associated with it. So the first tier or the first agreement that actually applies where we have formal obligations is now the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. So that's a little bit of history on that.
Okay, appreciate that.
Okay, do you have a follow-up, and then I'll go?
Yes, I
Yeah,
do. Just
go
on
ahead,
that
Peter.
specific point, Cal, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, that is goods and services, is that
And
correct?
construction, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And can I have,
Absolutely,
that was just
yeah, no,
that was a
no.
confirmation
Yeah, go ahead.
rather than a question. Robbie mentioned the road clearing and sanding of roads. That's a service, that's not a good. And I don't know what the split is between services and goods when it comes to expenditures in government, but the fact that we have services excluded from any sort of formal process, the Treasury Board policy is where it sits, I understand. That's a real concern for me. We talk often about transparency and accountability here. And the fact that we are working with policies within Treasury Board rather than an act and regulations which are mandating what the process should be is a real concern for me. When it comes to local, I note that it may go up to 10%. That's not a terribly strong either in terms of its figure or its wording. That's not a very strong recommendation or piece of policy. And I'm wondering how often that has been employed and why it was not made mandatory, why that is a may rather than a shall.
So, I'm sorry, you're asking is
Yeah,
why services...
Why local preference is there as an option? It's may, and it's up to 10%. Why was that not, for example, shall? and be 10% minimum, or, you know, whatever, why the decision was made?
Well, we want to leave the decision up to the entity, Department or Crown, if they would like to use it or not. As I said, they have no obligation. There may be in some circumstances where they wish not to use it. It may depend on cost. You know, there could be, it's just put in there so they have the option to use it.
Maybe if I can just add to that a little bit. Obviously, we did look at, as part of our jurisdictional scan, and looking, should we go higher than 10% or not? One of the first provinces that had put forward a local preference clause was Newfoundland. They looked at the 10%. And we looked at that closely. They do have a mandatory usage of that. As you move up into different, like as an example, the Crown corporations, where their levels on goods are up to $528,000, you can imagine that the larger the procurements get, you still want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence, and it's a balance between supporting local but also making sure taxpayer dollars are best utilized. And as you can imagine, the larger the procurements get, the difference between going local versus going off island could be substantial. So I think that it provides flexibility and up for the procuring entity, whether it could be a Crown corporation or a department, to make those decisions. And we felt that to put in a mandatory wouldn't be necessarily the best usage of taxpayer dollars in all cases.
I'll come back to you, Peter. Okay, thanks. Gord?
Thanks a lot. This is very informative. Before, just on the local pricing preference, before this went into place, were you seeing a lot of local companies losing out by slim margins like that during that 10%? What were your observations for the last 3 or 4 years before that?
I can't give you the exact data. I don't have that here with me right now, but I would answer that as a yes. We had seen where there were local vendors losing by a very small margin, and with this new clause in place, it should help our local vendors going forward.
Gord?
Do you have any estimates financially how that will affect the province, or how much money we'll be able to retain in the province moving forward? What's the impact of that?
Well, forecasting for what tenders might come forward is very hard to determine. So having said that, I really don't have any forecast numbers as far as what the departments or entities will require. We're hopeful that will support our local, it'd be more profitable for them.
Gord?
So you talked about Newfoundland being at 10%. Is that where you modeled the 10% from? And is that adequate, or is there room to move in the future up, giving all the trade agreements that we're talking about, or is that locked in for a certain period?
So at least keeping in mind this local preference clause can only be applied under thresholds, under trade thresholds. So if the province, and if there was a will to do so, you do have flexibility to move that in the future. You'd have to make an amendment to regulations to do so. But there would be flexibility to make those changes in the future, but keeping in mind that it would have to be under threshold. If it entered into above thresholds on what our obligations are from a trade perspective, then we wouldn't be able to apply it at those levels.
Gord?
No, and just the last one, I know that services are under another area, but it would be something I think that would be interesting to look at in the future, because PEI we're struggling with companies getting and competing with bigger companies throughout the area to get those agreements. So that's just a comment. So thanks a lot, Chair.
Great, thanks, Gord. Okay, so we've gone around. I'm going to just ask a couple of questions myself, and then we'll start another round for those that are on the list. So we've talked a lot about the local procurement clause, and I'm happy to see that. I guess my question is I know we've talked about that it's the responsibility of the Crown to determine whether they're going to use that clause or not. But I guess the question I have is, why wouldn't that clause just be in every agreement, and then if whoever is responding to it achieves the clause, then that multiplier would be applied at that point in time instead of determining at the very beginning? I'm just wondering why that decision was made.
Do you want to speak to that as what we learned from
Why, so in terms of that clause being put into all agreement, it's possible, so these, keep in mind, these are under thresholds, that right now the entity would only utilize the local preference clause if you're actually making it a public tender, whereby off-island companies can bid on that particular tender. So you wouldn't apply a local preference if you're only going local. It wouldn't make sense to have your own local folks. They should be on a level playing ground, and so there wouldn't be any need. So the thought would be you have the option to put in the local preference when you feel that you should be going public, or you may have an existing supplier now, today, that you're using off-island, and in those circumstances, if you actually want to continue on, or at least have that off-island supplier maybe bid on your tender, then you could apply it in those circumstances. So that was the thinking of why you wouldn't apply it in all situations.
Okay. I'm just going to go back, because so I have a question here is, how do you ensure that the 10% was actually adhered to? So if it was in the bid versus, like, did it come to fruition? And I'm going to go back to, I'd asked questions in the House about local procurement, and the minister at the time had come back and said, it's very difficult to see numbers in our procurement system to calculate, that local component. And when referenced a 2017-2018 review, an analysis of spending that was done in 2017-2018 fiscal year that stated 70% of procurement, excluding services, were done locally, and then an additional 8% were done in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So that was kind of the response around local procurement. So I guess my question is what limitations are within the system for you to be able to pull data out of it in order to be able to look at where are those tendering and procurement dollars being spent, and how flexible is the system that you're using?
Okay, so we do have a reporting. We do we do record our data as to where our dollars are being spent, whether it be in what province. And as far as tracking our local procurement going forward with using the preference clause, we now have a new data or a new reporting system that we're going to use in-house in procurement services to track, to see where more local procurement is happening.
Okay,
going forward.
Thank you. And is that already implemented, that system? So it's something that you can pull reports on now, and is it fairly flexible, and you can do it like monthly, for instance, or?
We're just starting to implement it now, so can I say it's up and running at the moment? No, but it's something we're moving forward to get done quickly. Okay, so we can have reporting.
And when do you expect that to be up and running? What is your delivery date on it?
I'm hoping within the next month. It's just something we're doing in small data reporting within procurement services. That we will house in-house and control in-house.
Okay. And you referenced policies and Treasury Board policies on the services side. Are the Treasury Board policies available publicly?
Really? I don't think that they are. They're internal policies. I don't want to mislead you. I'm not sure if they're external to public or not.
Okay. Would that be a good thing to know if services are procured through Treasury Board policy, that's actually public, so people can see the policies on service procurement?
Well, I guess that question would have to be directed to Treasury Board, as they own the policy, right? What we do in our office is we ensure that the entities follow the Treasury Board policies. I guess that would be a question for Treasury Board.
Okay.
But I can take that back as a suggestion.
Okay, thank you. And then I just want to go back, and then I'm going to hand it off to other members. You had talked about a centralized procurement system, and construction tenders are done through transportation infrastructure. Health PEI is completed through health. Are they required to follow the same the same legislation and regulations as you are required to follow?
Sure. So Health PEI, yes, they would fall under Schedule B as an entity, as a crown, and they are obligated to follow our new act and regulations. As far as construction is also, their policies come from Treasury Board as well. Okay? So for Health PEI, yes, they fall under an entity B, so they would follow our regulations.
Okay, but construction doesn't, so transportation infrastructure does not follow?
They do, but they do if it's for a good, but if it's for services and construction, it would be through Treasury Board policies.
Okay,
Okay? It's a bit.
Construction, there's, for departments, for transportation, infrastructure, and energy, they would have to follow all the trade agreements as well. So there's a list of construction provisions in there, as well as exceptions that they have for that specific department as well, for construction contracts.
okay. I have Carla next on the list. Go ahead, Carla.
Thank you, Chair. So going back to supporting local, and in the presentation, it appears that the bidding process focuses solely on price. Do you have a methodology for the determination of value? If we consider, let's say we consider a product that's maybe cost higher on the island than it does elsewhere. However, we consider that the fact that it's going to spin off the economy, so jobs, people are able to spend their money, have money to spend, and all of those things. Do we take any of that into consideration, and what that's worth to our economy?
So we do have in our regulations, we do have where we talk about we could use a percentage if we are to evaluate a good on a point system, okay? So if let's say on the onset it's determined that if it's a local company, they may receive, I'll just use an example, 10%, okay? So that 10% will go, it's not based on best price, it can be based on a different pricing matrix. This is new to us.
Carla?
So this is something that is set in the regulations that will be followed every time a decision is made?
That depends on if the department or the entity is going to use the scoring matrix in that manner or as in best price. We didn't have this option before. This is just new. It's very brand new. And I do need to get out to our crowns and all of our entities and give further education onto our regulations. Cal and I are going to be in the very near future, what we call a roadshow, go out to our entities and really define what our regulations are and some changes, and perhaps maybe they might use them better going forward, or more helpful.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to ask you to break this down for me a little bit because I don't quite understand the full process. What would lead them to decide which one to use? What would be a deciding factor for them?
So, procuring entities, whether it's a department or a crown corporation, can utilize and incorporate technical specifications, and it kind of goes to some of the other comments around quality previously as well. If the procuring entity wants to include not just price but other technical specifications into a tender, they can do so. But the local preference clause would only apply on the pricing portion of the the scoring matrix or the criteria. So that's one thing. Now, how do you ensure value? Has there been a particular formula to extrapolate or determine what value is going to look like? I think it's going to be based on what the criteria are. So if you're looking at a price quality relationship, that's what the technical specifications that you might include into a tender beyond just price.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair. So there's no real motivation for people to support local sort of thing. Like it's still left up to them to decide kind of to see what's best for them.
That's correct. As procurement services, I wouldn't tell an entity that they have to use it. It would be determined in-house within the entity.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair. I'm gonna, so how do you determine that the policies you discussed in the presentation are being applied consistently across departments?
Okay. So that's part of our education piece, our rollout piece, when we get to meet with the Crowns or all of the entities to ensure that they have knowledge of our new regulations, and going forward that they will implement them to the best they can.
Carla?
Thank you, Chair. I'm gonna just change gears a little bit, and I'm gonna ask this question even though I suspect based on previous answers this hasn't been considered. I'm wondering if there's any sort of gender requirements for procurement. I know at the federal level they have implemented regulations, requirements that gender be considered. Because, you know, in chatting with various women's and gender diverse groups, that was one of the things we talked about in terms of systemic barriers to make changes we know need to happen, you know, and to see the relation between, you know, getting more women into traditionally male fields and procurement might seem like a huge jump, but it's really not. And you know, if we're going to do this, then this should happen as well. And so I'm wondering if there's been any discussion on that in-house.
As far as within our procurement services office, we have not had any of those discussions thus far. But I will definitely take back the suggestion.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Carla?
So I know the other day the province is hiring, I forget the term that they use, but a gender diversity analyst or something like that. So that might be something to look into. I think that absolutely there should be a gender-based analysis, a diversity lens put on our procurement policy to ensure that, you know, that we are kind of getting rid of some of those systemic barriers for people. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I will bring that back to our team. Okay.
Thank you. Peter?
Thanks, Chair. I want to, you know, I've been in this job now for about almost 6 years, and my initial understanding of what procurement was it was contracting. It was how we contract with an entity outside government. But the more I've read about it, the deeper I understand it. It's far more than that. It's about contracting is part of it, but there's a pre-contracting phase where you have to come forward with a strategic plan, make a business case, do a needs assessment, budgeting, all of those things before you even get to contracting. And then afterwards there should be a follow-up to find out whether we have indeed got value for money out of the contract that we signed with a particular entity. And I know that the mandate of this committee is to improve public management, which strikes me that procurement is a huge part of public expense here on Prince Edward Island. And I need to be comforted that we have a process both prior to the contracting portion, and also that there is always a follow-up with each contract that is signed and carried out with an entity outside government, to make sure that we are actually getting what we paid for, and that we learn if things do not go well. Does that process exist?
So in reference to goods, since this act is for goods only, to my knowledge, the entity, or I'll say department as we have known it in the past, which would fall under a mandate, yes, that they do review the contracts, or let's say the good that they have procured, and to ensure that it is of good value, it's in working shape, it's doing the service that, or performing the service of what they purchased it for. So that would be managing their contract in-house. We do not manage contracts within our procurement services office. As our resources are so low, that is up to the entity to perform.
Peter?
Thanks, Laurie. And that's a couple of times now you've mentioned that the capacity of your office is very small. And you're doing a very important job, and critically important job, in terms of oversight and accountability of spending of public funds. You've also mentioned that unusually here on Prince Edward Island, we have a decentralized accountability framework whereby each department essentially is responsible for overseeing their own procurement, and they report back to you, presumably. But how much time you have to actually look through those reports, or what you get back, I'm concerned about that. Many things, I think, are better decentralized. When it comes to the oversight of the spending of public money, however, I think I prefer a centralized model. And of all the ones I've looked at, Newfoundland strikes me as the best thing. It's overseeing both goods and services in one place, and that really needs to be fixed here. The fact that we have two different places overseeing procurement, and one of them only with policy, no regulation, no statutory requirement, that's a huge concern for me. But in Newfoundland, because of the independence of the body that looks after procurement, that takes away all of the potential for politicization of the procurement process. I think we're extraordinarily vulnerable here at Prince Edward Island, given the structure that we have, with such weak oversight, such lack of accountability, and no fault of your own, Laurie, or your office, just simply not enough person power to do a proper oversight role that is so critical here. So I see all kinds of red flags here that the procurement process here in Prince Edward Island is in desperate need of modernization and tightening up. And I'm wondering where we should look for the impetus to do that. The first thing for me is getting services rolled into either this act or a similar act to get it out of Treasury Board and away from policy. Where in government do you think that modernization of the procurement process on Prince Edward Island should take place?
Where do I think it should take place?
Yeah.
I know that it is recognized that we perhaps we could look centralized, perhaps we should look centralized. I have been in discussions where they've talked about possibility of maybe having a review of procurement services and how we look. And perhaps how we should look and how other jurisdictions do look, and as you had mentioned, outside of the ministerial. I just know that has been mentioned as far as a timeline as to when that will happen. I'm not the best one to answer that, but I know that it has been mentioned that may be a possibility in the future.
Peter?
Thanks, Chair. One thing that Robbie mentioned earlier, and I really appreciated, was the lifetime cost as opposed to the upfront cost of something. In New Brunswick, they have a sustainable procurement policy which takes into account the lifetime cost and other aspects as well, sustainability being both environmental and economic and social. But I'm wondering whether there's been any talk within the procurement department here of putting in place a similar sustainability procurement policy so that we can include all of the costs when we make a bid on something, not just what the upfront cost is, but what the lifetime cost, and whether we would actually be saving money if we weren't to buy the cheapest option up front?
As far as sustainability, well, I guess it goes back to our number of resources that we have in our office to be able to actually work through that process and to be able to monitor it. So therefore, those requirements or obligations will be left within the department or entity to look after at this point in time.
Peter?
Again, a concern that we don't have a coordinated, centralized, well-managed approach to this. And again, I'm not criticizing you
No.
at all here, Laurie. I'm just looking at the framework, the structure that we have here in Prince Edward Island, and recognizing, perhaps for the first time, at least for me, that we really have a lot of work to do here to make our procurement process more accountable and to give maximum benefit and value for money for islanders. So I think I've got all my questions answered for now.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Great. I'm just going to follow up on something that Peter had said there, and I was wondering, your presentation didn't outline what the monetary value of the tenders that you process on an annual basis are. How much would out of this process, out of the excluding health, PEI, and construction, would your office
Our
actually
office.
process?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I will take it back to you. Okay.
Thank you. And to that point.
And we're speaking to goods only, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, actually, I'd love to know services as well. Does that go through your office, services through the policy?
So each entity is responsible for looking after their own contracts, but I can bring that back as well.
Okay, thank you. But for your office specifically, if you could let us also know how many resources you have working on, and kind of how many tenders and that kind of thing that your office would process on an annual basis.
Sure.
You
And that
wouldn't
can all
mind
be
sharing
found in the
that?
annual report, but I will bring it back to you.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll definitely bring it back.
Yeah. I'd just like to touch on the selection process, if I could. Could you tell me what, I assume that there's a committee in place that would participate in the selection of when you're reviewing a tender, like tender responses. Can you tell me who is part of that committee?
Okay. So what happens is when a tender closes, at closing time, our procurement officer would gather the data or the submissions together. We would produce a tender summary, and then it is sent back to the department for evaluation. We do not participate, as Procurement Services Office, we do not participate in the evaluation
Okay.
at this present time. However, I will add to that.
Yeah.
If an evaluation, if an entity comes back to Procurement Services with an evaluation, at that point in time, if something sticks out as a red flag to our Procurement Services or to our Procurement Officer, they would go back and ask the department, why did you select this one? If we have a concern as to perhaps the right vendor was not selected at the time.
Okay. So when we're talking about like a crown, is there any policies developed as to who could sit on that selection committee based on, we'd want to talk about, we've talked about arm's length and actually having it, completely removed out of something that could, is there policies around recusing yourself from making a decision if you're in conflict of interest or, anything like that? Is there any policies for the Crowns to follow?
So the Crowns, Schedule B, they look after their own, as department in-house review or evaluation, and what their internal policies are with regards to that, but there's nothing in our act or regulations.
Okay. I want to touch on the implementation plan for this current
Sure.
legislation. It's just been proclaimed. Peter's referenced, I believe it was Manitoba, that has a 5-year plan for implementation. Can you outline what your implementation plan is now that the regulations are developed and the act has been proclaimed? What's your next steps
Okay.
and how long will that take?
Okay. As far as time, the this will depend on if it's virtual or not virtual. We have to make those, sit down and make those plans. As far as length of time, I'm not sure, but we do need to make our entities aware of the new regulations and the Act and guidelines that they are to follow. Did I
Okay.
answer that as what you wanted? Or
Well, and I think what I heard is we don't have an implementation plan yet.
we
Is
don't
that-
have a full schedule
Okay.
as of yet.
With the development of the regulations and the proclamation of the Act, is there a list of policies that are yet to develop based on those regulations, or has all the policy development been completed?
As far as policies, it would be our regulations that we'll be following
Okay.
going forward. As individual in-house policies, I don't know
There's
of any.
none to develop?
No.
Okay. So when you, I guess when you go out to the Schedule A and Schedule B to do your implementation plan, is there like a educational piece that still needs to be developed as well, or has that been completed?
No, it has not been completed. No, we are just at the beginning stages of preparing to do our education piece with regards to our new regulations.
Okay. So the act was proclaimed, and I believe it was effective last month? Is that, and so when do you plan to have a documented implementation plan, and how long do you expect that to take to fully implement?
We will begin in-house to start to prepare documentation as far as education, okay, outlining the highlights, just like we did here today, of changes in regulations. Yes, I do understand what you're saying in December. It just outlined in December. There's a lot of factors that have come into place with our office looking for PPE requirements and trying to, I guess what I'm saying, there's other duties as well that we're trying to unravel. But as far as a timeline, I would think that within the next month to 6 weeks that we should be getting out in front of our entities and with further education. That would be my hope.
Okay. So I'll just ask, I don't have anybody else on the speaker list. Is there anybody else that had questions? Okay. So this act received royal assent in 2016, and it was just proclaimed in 2021, well, December 31st, 2020. Can you tell me what was the time, why such a delay in developing the regulations?
Sure. I will speak to that, and then Cal, I'll let you finish. So in 2018, when I first started in this chair in the summer of 2018, we had then found out that we were going to be audited in procurement services. So that took a lot of our time and energy with our obligations to the AG and giving them information to perform their audit. We also had some trade implications. Will Cal speak to?
With the negotiation or renegotiation of the agreement on internal trade, which became the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, that was implemented in 2017. There was also the Canada-European Union, which came into force in 2017. There was also discussions around, at least with our shop, on the trade side with procurement around the Atlantic Procurement Agreement and what the next step would be on that. So I think there was just a lot of moving parts in terms of what the overarching obligations look like from a procurement perspective. So those were some of the factors playing into when was the right time. Can't speak to the 2016, but just those are some of the outstanding factors and negotiations and entry into force of new procurement obligations on the province that were being undertaken at the time.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I will jump off something that Peter was discussing around a long-term strategic plan. And is that something that you plan within your office to start that work on a long-term strategic plan? Or would that be something that would not be within, I guess, your capabilities at this point in time based on resourcing? And so can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
So are you referring to as to how we would look as going forward if there was a, okay.
Well, I guess I'll elaborate. So, I mean, when you go through some of the, some documentation, you look out into other jurisdictions and what the best practices are around, you know, and they're well defined from a global perspective, especially within, you know, the OECD, right? Like with the 30, there's 30 countries and they've defined procurement best practices. And I know Peter spoke to the ramp up to actually submitting a tender of the work that a department should do prior to that, which includes business cases and all of those pieces, is, you know, that would be part of building a strategic plan. So that I wrote down here, how does you had mentioned value and whether we got the value that we were planning, but how do you determine what the value is if there wasn't a business plan at the beginning of that process to tell you, you know, this is what the expectation was and this is what the value was and this is how the value for money that we spent. So that upfront process is well documented and is something that's of great importance when you then begin that tendering process, right? It's the work prior to that to determine what you actually need. So based on that and, you know, what we've seen as best practices out there for procurement, is that something that the department will, or that your office will eventually start looking outwards to build on what you've currently got, and what would be the time frame that you would expect to start that process?
So as I said before, in our office, we guide the entities with as far as the procurement processes. Any of what you shall talk about, those processes will be held in office within the entity. Do we have the capacity to do so within our 4-people office? We really just don't have that. And as far as what we may look like in the future, should there be a review of what we should look like, perhaps we can implement those processes in-house. But right now, we're just the capacity is just not there.
Okay, thank you. You had referenced a Auditor General audit.
Yeah.
Can you, was that in 2018?
2018.
Okay.
It's fall of 2018.
Right, and so it was in the 2019?
It started in fall of 2018.
And completed when?
2019. Right now, I just can't think of the month.
Okay. All right, does anybody else have any questions? Oh, I'm sorry, Peter, right. Yes, Peter?
Just to follow up on that, Laurie, I wasn't aware of that audit. What was the scope of that?
The scope of that was to review if departments were following our regulations and policies. And we had to follow up by giving supporting documentation to the AG as to whether or not a transaction within a department followed within our regulations of its practice of procurement. Yeah,
Sorry, Laurie?
Yep. And as a result, we had some recommendations, so we are still ongoing and implementing them. With regards to our regulations coming forth now, that will help with some of the recommendations that were suggested at the time.
Peter?
Maybe a final comment, Chair. procurement sits in finance, the
Yes.
Department of Finance, and reading through the mandate letter, procurement isn't mentioned at all, which sort of surprised me, given how much money is spent, you know, through the procurement process. Again, yeah, it's really not a question. It's a comment that we spent tons of money. You've referenced yet again the under-resourced nature of the office in which you work. The fact that the ministerial mandate letter didn't even mention procurement as a priority, and I think we're beyond time for a significant review of how we procure services here, partly to make your job easier, actually, Laurie, and give you the tools that you need to be able to provide the accountability and the oversight that Islanders deserve for the spending of public money. So this morning has been very illuminating for me, and I appreciate you both being here. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And I'm just looking, the audit was in the 2019 annual report, and there was, I believe, 10 recommendations, all of which the timeline for completion was December 31st, 2019. Can you maybe give us, I know I'm putting you on the spot, it's not what you were invited in to speak to, but can you give us an update on where those recommendations are?
Well, I wasn't prepared to speak to that,
No,
but
that's fair.
I get that. So we do have some ongoing work. We do have some recommendations that are completed. We do have some recommendations that we have ongoing work to try and complete. And our regulations will help with our new regulations will help with some of those recommendations.
Okay, and I will just, and I know you didn't come in prepared to speak to this, so you feel free to say, I'll get back to you or whatever, but at the time, December 31st, 2019 was the timeline for completion. I do understand now we've gone through COVID, but the anticipated timelines were prior to that, the end of 2019. So do you have a sense as to how many have been completed out of?
I can take that back to you.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, any other, Carla?
I just have one question. I wasn't going to ask it, but it's just sitting here, and so I'm going to. We see countries all around the world where procurement is used as a way to reward and support compliance. And I'm just wondering, what's safety measures? Peter, you may have already kind of asked this question indirectly, but I'm still lingering here. But I'm wondering what safety measures are in place to protect taxpayers' money and to kind of prevent the misuse or the missteps that we see around the world when it comes to procurement. Is there any sort of thing that we have on PEI special or different that kind of keeps that accountability in place? I guess it's more of a thought, because I know that.
I don't know if you can clarify what a misstep might define that. I'm just curious what that, like internationally, I think what we're seeing as an example out of the U.S. right now, and what we're likely to see around the Biden administration is around Buy American policies and what made in U.S. and supporting federal funds going into state level and local level governments in the U.S. And utilizing grant funding that is, and then using that at the procurement and tendering level at those levels to drive U.S. Buy local programs. So I'm trying to understand what you mean by misstep, and it's just more of a question before we can potentially answer that.
Thank you. And you just see around the world. I'm not suggesting that that we see anyway. Just the corruption that can happen, right? And rewarding people who support you and not going through the exact proper steps. And I just am so concerned, as I especially consider that services sits in a place where there's just it's not public and there's no accountability. And I share the concerns about that. So I guess not so much a question, because I think that what I was asking earlier about the checklists and the various questions, that would be kind of the accountability piece. So I guess I'm just kind of repeating myself in different ways, but I just find that very concerning. So I guess more of a comment than a question. Thank you.
I'll ask about annual reporting, and You mentioned that there are metrics that are in the annual report around procurement. Did I hear you correctly when you said that?
Sorry. In our annual report, we do submit to our controller the number of tenders that have been processed, RFPs, the total value of P-card spend, and the total value of our purchases through POs,
Okay.
purchase orders.
And will your annual reporting change as, now with the new regulations being out, is there new measurements that you're looking at that you think that you need to report on publicly?
It hasn't been brought to my attention, but I can definitely bring that back as a suggestion going forward, as an addition to our annual report.
Okay. I'm interested in the level of transparency after an award has happened. So currently, I believe what happens is the person who was successful in their bid, or the company that was successful in their bid, is listed on the website as to who that was. Okay?
Correct, yes.
And that's standard practice for all awarded bids. How quickly does that go up online once it's awarded?
Okay, so once it's awarded, if it's a service, it doesn't go online until the contract is actually signed.
Okay.
For a good, it would go up immediately.
Okay. And was there any discussion around creating more transparency around that? For instance, how many bids were received, or putting out the names of the companies like 1, 2, 3 that in the ranking, just to kind of give more transparency to companies that have, that wrote in on an RFP but have no idea where they ended up in the process. Like, was there discussion around that?
I do know that other provinces do exactly what you're saying as far as what they show on their site. There hasn't been any discussion, but my hope is that we will move forward to that and be more transparent and have more information available on our site, tendering site.
Okay, and is that information readily available if somebody was to contact the department and ask, why one company was selected over another?
The evaluation?
Yes.
The evaluation would be held within our office, yes. As far for goods, yes.
But is that a public document?
So if it's public, if you have submitted a bid, if a vendor has submitted a bid on a tender, it is available to whomever may have submitted a bid.
So how do you come about your definition as to what is a government record? Because government records are are public documents, right? Why is it only available to people who have submitted a bid? And you might, we just had a special committee on government record retention, and so we had a lot of discussion around what is a government record, and records of decisions would be government records, therefore available to the public if they wanted it. So why would that not be available to the public?
Sure, okay. What I can say is that's a process that has been in place. Obviously, since you're talking about government records, this is something now that we will need to speak to our RIM coordinator to see if this is in fact a government record. So I'll take that back as a possibility to look at improving or changing.
Okay, but would you say, though, that your scoring sheet that you would use is your record of decision?
Our scoring matrix?
Yeah, would be your record of decision
Yes.
on awarding.
Right.
Okay, I would.
Whether they would meet, as far as it goes, whether they meet specs or not meet specs.
If they meet specs, no, I mean like when you go through your whole evaluation process and award a tender, you go through a decision-making process and you would have a record of decision on that.
Yes, the file would be all kept within our office.
Okay,
All submissions and the suggested award all of those documents would stay within our office.
Okay. And accessible to people who have submitted a bid, but not accessible to anybody else?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Sure, Sid?
Just to follow up on that, I know, and thank you both for being here. When companies submit bids, they can be there for when they reply to a tender, they can be there for the bid opening for many things. In COVID times, how does that work now? I think to Michelle's point, I think things are very transparent for the people that are bidding. Like, there's no messing around. They see what each other's doing. Like, you can have all that information. They can request that, and I like that. But I'm now curious about, for those openings now, how does that work? Are they allowed in, or does it automatically get the bids get sent out to all the people that tendered?
So during COVID right now, we haven't been having any public openings. And we haven't been requested to have any either as well. Should we be requested to have one, we would make provisions that we would be in a boardroom to have the public opening.
Sid?
That's good, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I'm just one final. I'll go back to, I'd asked about if somebody was in conflict and if there was a process for them to recuse themselves from the decision. Is there any follow-up from your office if somebody was in conflict that made a decision? Is there any code of conduct or anything like that that is identified through your office as to if, outlining that for an organization?
No, we don't have anything in office in our procurement services.
Okay. Do you know if that's something that other jurisdictions do?
That I don't know. But do you
Okay.
want me to do a scan and report back?
I think that's okay. I think I can have a look to see.
Okay.
I can do that. Sounds like your office has lots to do.
I do.
Okay. Is there any other questions from members? Okay. So I'd like to thank you both for coming in. This has been very informative for me, and I sure many more questions will arise, and we look forward to the information that you're going to bring back, and Ryan can be the person that you can send that information into, and that would be great, and that'll get out to the committee. And with that, we'll take just a short recess while we reset. So thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. All right, thank you. And we're going to move on to number 4. So number 4, we had a request from member Gord McNeely to have the committee look at the unspent COVID-19 funding, and there's a letter in your package that was received from Gord on January 28th. And Gord suggested inviting the Minister of Finance to appear and explain why the province has left millions in federal money unspent. Our committee has an open slot Tuesday, February 2nd, 2021. In my opinion, our committee should offer the time slot to the Minister of Finance. So I will open that letter up for discussion. Gord?
Well, I would say that we need to, look at bringing her in or a representative from finance to talk about this. I mean, it came from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. There's money left on the table for COVID health measures, long-term care supports, the pay portion of the safe restart for municipalities and transit systems. So there's some things to talk about, and I think they're talking about, the minister indicated that money will be spent by March 31st, but we haven't seen a plan yet. So I think I would like to see this committee look at that and bring the minister or a representative in to talk about that.
Okay, discussion? Rob?
I guess my only comment would be is that some federal representatives in the province have identified that there's been money not spent. I've heard numbers from 80 to 90% of the COVID spending has been federal, and yet we have the Minister of Finance that said that no, there's no money left on the table. So I guess just only because there's that confusion between the two points of view on it, it'd be nice to get a bit of a sense. I'd also add in, there's some pretty large contingency funds in each government department. Maybe that will suffice. Maybe that's what they're spending, and that's why they're not tapping into some of that federal, if that is the case. I don't have the evidence to say one way or the other than just the ambiguity of comments from our federal representatives in Ottawa, as well as the opposite view from our Minister of Finance and PEI. So it would be nice to get a little more clarity to eliminate some of that confusion if in fact there is a unspent money or not.
Okay, Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. I think the confusion came from just the nature of the report. It was simply wrong. The author was using numbers from last spring's budget, so of course it's a projected budget. That money's not spent yet. It was it was a false report, and the author has since come back and corrected himself. I'm sure, Gord, since then you've read that, so I think your letter is probably premature and not needed. The confusing part, Michelle, your office put out a statement, which hasn't been retracted yet either, which has been refuted by the minister and the author of the report. So that's the confusing part, is that everybody jumped on it immediately when someone put a random report out there that didn't actually have the facts in it. I would like to know, of course, where every single dollar is being spent. The immediate money right off the bat is being looked at by the AG. We're going to review, as all the legislators are going to, the budget when it comes back. We'll see where it's spent. The AG, the blue books do all that. So, this talk of no money spent is ridiculous. I've heard the Premier say that, the money will be spent and they would look for more. We need it at this time of year. So, I think there's been a lot. That week-long reaction after was unfortunate. I'm quite comfortable that the money is being spent where it's supposed to be being spent, and I think the confusing part was the reaction to a report that didn't have the correct facts. It's just my comment.
Thank you. Any other comments? Gord?
Well, I would just think that, I think this is the right place to have that discussion. There's a lot of good finances coming into Prince Edward Island from the federal government, and I just want to make sure that we have spent, or we're on track, and we have a plan to use that money efficiently for Islanders during this past time. And I'm uncertain about how that's been spent and where we are. And March 31st, I just don't want to see the last week of March a whole bunch of money go out that's not properly looked at. So I think there's room for discussion, there's room to have the finance minister or representative in, and I stand by that. This is this is a lot of money on the table, and we're just trying to make sure that this committee sees that money's spent efficiently for Islanders.
Rob?
I'll just add into it too. I think it's one thing to say that the money's spent. If it might be spent, it might not be. But it should be spent for the intentions that it was intended to be in the purposes of dealing with COVID. And so I think there's a little more to it than just that the money be spent. And, we've had people like the Prime Minister, we've had a federal MP saying that, $8 to $9 of the $10 spent on COVID have been federal monies. Whether that's accurate or not, I don't know. But it just seems like we're getting mixed comments from, I will hope to say that these are fairly credible people, even this group. If they've refuted some of their issues, that's fine too. But there's still a lot of, once again, unanswered questions. So I'd like to just get a little more clarity from my end. I'm not looking for more work or anything, but it would seem that just a little more clarity and making sure that the money is spent for its intentions is important as well as just having it been spent.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments? Sid?
Thank you, Chair. I'd point out that that's the job of the Public Accounts Committee. We do that every year, so I'm not sure why all of a sudden you want to do it in the middle of the year. Like, that is our job, to review the public document. We go over the blue books each year. We receive the copy of them here today. So why are you prejudging it? And Robbie, you're right. It's more like 9 out of every $10. And both the finance minister and the Premier on record saying thank you for that. But all that money it's rolled in, and we review it as a public accounts. I don't understand why, because of a random report and sharp political reactions to it before we had the details, we need to bring in the minister or representatives before we get the next budget. Like, if we're going to be doing that as a committee anyway, what other than a political play to bring them in to say, oh, we didn't spend it where you're supposed to spend it. That's the job of government, is to budget out, and then we check to see where they spent it at when the year's done. If we don't agree with it as public accounts, we hold them to account. I don't, like, I'm not going to vote again, if you want to bring them in, but I just don't see, it doesn't make any sense to me to bring them in right now. We're going into House session in 3 weeks.
Yeah. Carla?
I guess for me, even the topic aside, I was confused at getting that email. And so I'm wondering, was the urgency, because we read out the mandate every day, we have a place for new business to talk about every day, so I'm wondering if the urgency to this was because we were trying to get them, and I guess this is kind of a question, but were we trying to get them in for February 2nd? Is that why kind of the rush?
Yes.
Gord? Okay. Okay, Carla?
Okay, no, I was just curious about that. I was just confused.
Corey?
Did we invite the AG's office in to give us an update on their look at this COVID spending so far? Was that?
Last meeting, the AG was in and gave us an update, and
Yes, they did.
there's
They
3
were-
phases that they're
yeah.
working on. Yeah. I don't know where this funding would reside in those 3 phases, but any other thoughts on it? So I'll give thoughts. I know if that's okay. So y'all might remember I brought forward one of the issues that I see is we don't have a finance committee, which is a place where you can talk about fiscal policy and the merits of it. Public accounts is about money that's been spent, and it's about talking about, well, we say it right here, it's the committee examines administration of government policy, not the merits of it. So this really, I just don't know where that space is to talk about it, because we don't have that typical structure of a public accounts committee and a finance committee. We have one where it would seem that all things finance would fall under us. However, it also runs the risk of jeopardizing the integrity of the Public Accounts Committee and, as you said, Sydney, becoming political in a space that we have all agreed to be nonpartisan. And to speak about money that's not been spent, does go against our purpose and values statement in that we're talking about the merits of the policy. So I've thought about this a lot as to where it would reside, and because we don't have a finance committee, it isn't about the Department of Finance spending money, it's about the individual departments not having spent money. And if that is the case or not, or if there's unleft dollars that were left on the table or whatever, it could almost reside in the departments in which were identified as possibly not having spent the money, for instance, in health and in housing and those kinds of areas. So I was wondering if there was to be a discussion on this, not wanting to shut you down because understanding that you're a member and you have the right to bring forward anything, I do feel like we have a little bit of a deficit as to where is the space for us to have that discussion, in the fact that we don't have a finance committee to review estimates and all that kind of stuff. If it's the merits of the policy that you're looking to review as to why didn't they request the money, it really resides, I think, in asking the departments why they didn't spend the money versus, if that's the case and that's what happened, and it would be going out to the departments to asking that, versus bringing it into public accounts, which through our training we were trained that this standing committee is about money that's been spent, not money that it was left on the table. So I understand that we're in a gray zone just because of our structure, but Rob?
Well, I guess when it comes to saying whether it's money spent or not spent, we've got two stories. We've got one story saying that it has been spent and will be spent, and then we've got another story that's saying from a group that's a Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, although they might have changed some of their views.
Who admitted they used last spring's numbers?
Well, they're still a credible organization to deal with policy.
Not if they're lying. They're not.
Well, I mean, they still come out, they're still a group, or they're a completely irrelevant group. I mean, they're a policy organization. So from my end, it's not a matter whether they come in or not politically. It doesn't have to be the minister. It doesn't have to, just somebody to answer the question. Okay, no, the money is all spent, everybody. Don't worry about it. Mm-hmm. That's fine. And then we've spent it in accordance. That will be reviewed later on. I don't think this has to be a lot.
Right, but I will point out that there's still time for it to be. So is that a discussion that you have with the departments rather than within this committee? That's just what I'm highlighting. Gord?
Well, I mean, you could do it that way, but it has to start with somebody and some accountability. That money was allocated from the finance minister to the departments. We had a COVID document in the floor of the legislature. We never got through. There was a lot of funding in there. We didn't get through it. That wasn't really kept to account in the floor of the legislature. I mean, so I really think it's time that the finance minister come in, or somebody from that area, talk about the transfer of money from federally. Why have we put that money into long-term care supports? There's municipalities talking about not getting their funding. So we need to talk about those things, and I do believe that this is the place to do it.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. The place to do it is in the floor of the legislature. We go line by line for the budget. I'm not understanding. I don't think you understand the process here. The AG is reviewing all COVID spending. As legislature, we are going to go through it line by line when it's spent. It is pointless to bring somebody in right now. You, in 3 weeks, are going to get to go through line by line and ask these things. When the blue books come back, we're going to get to ask these things. To bring someone in now, it's just a political move, plain and simple.
Okay. Rob?
I don't think it's a political move. It's just like COVID has created a whole lot of unknowns, I guess, and there's lots of money that's been spent, and I'm not here to try to make any political advantage of it, just to find out the answer on the questions: was the money spent or was it not spent, and in accordance to what the goals and objectives were when Ottawa contributed the money. I'm just one person. I support the committee. If the committee chooses not to go with this, that's fine too. I'm just saying from what I see as a person that's been in the legislature for some time, yes, I have lots of opportunities to ask questions on the floor of the legislature. When ministers take their budgets on the floor, I have all those opportunities, and we'll probably use it at that time too. But maybe my questions would be far less if somebody as a representative came in and said, this is what money we were given, this is where it was generally spent, and there's not going to be any money left over. It's as simple as that. So from my end, I respect everybody's view here, but I think we are, as a committee, trying to make sure that we're doing the proper fiscal management of the affairs of the province. I do think that these are policy decisions that get made and how money was spent. We did grant policy decisions to say contingency funds are far higher than they normally would be. So it's just a simple exercise in democracy and letting people know that two groups have made different statements. And let's see what the department says in refuting what this. I guess we're saying it's a rogue group that has no bearing. But anyway, whatever the arguments are, I'm not familiar with this group particularly, but they made a statement and.
We'll trust them.
Well, I'm not saying we don't trust them, but I mean, either they're a relevant group or they're not. And if they're relevant, then let's the department say that they made a lot of missteps in their assumptions, and we've corrected that. No big issue from my end. Yeah.
All right, any further thoughts? So I know we're not going, it doesn't sound like we're going to reach consensus on this one, but if there's no further discussion, I will put it out to a vote. And so I'll open it one more call. Well, do I need a motion?
You can ask for a motion. I think it's described in the letter what is being asked for. However, the member has mentioned, the letter says bring the Minister of Finance. The member has since said the Minister of Finance or a representative of Finance. So you might want to specify that in the motion before we put it to a vote.
So Gord, would you like to put forward a motion?
Yeah, well, invite someone from finance, either the Minister of Finance or a designate, to discuss the lack of take-up on federal programming, funding for COVID, and whether the COVID contingency has been used. That would be the $65 million to all the departments. So that would be the motion.
Okay, are we good with that, Ryan? So everybody is fine with the motion as it stands? Okay, all in favor of the motion, I'll get you to raise your hand. Okay, we have Gord and Rob. All those against the motion? Sydney, Corey, and Carla. Okay, so the motion's been defeated. Thank you for that. That was good conversation okay, so with that being completed, we'll move on to number 5, discussion on feedback request from the Auditor General. So areas of interest to consider in developing auditing work plans. Is there any members that have brought forward or have any topics that they would like to bring forward? Carla?
Just looking at considering whether government and the Mental Health Review Board are achieving their purpose and economically and efficiently, and that they're complying with the Mental Health Act. We have a really high number of individuals in the province who are held involuntarily in Prince Edward Island hospitals because of mental health conditions. So there was a FOIP request sent in, and our office was given some statistics on the number of individuals with completed involuntary admission under the Mental Health Act. And between 2016 and 2017, there was an increase of 52%, which is held over the past 4 years, and which is extremely concerning. Couple that with the fact that the website directs island residents to information regarding the Mental Health Review Board and their legal right to appeal and process. It's out of date, and it doesn't have the proper contact information. So I would love to see us look at that as a topic.
Okay, and based on, when we talked to the Auditor General, it was about the impact. Can you tell us how many, you said you've got the numbers there as to how many people are impacted?
Do you, the 2016-17 jump, or, so
Yeah.
basically in 2000, I'll just go through all the numbers. In 2014, there were 294, 2015, there were 240, in 2016, 289, and then the jump in 2017 was to 440, 2018, 491, 2019, 514, and then 2020, we did see a decline. I'm guessing that, I mean, I won't infer here, but I mean, COVID, and we know that people weren't accessing services in the way, so I'm not sure 2020 is an accurate reflection. But based on that significant increase every single year, clearly we have a problem here. Also, the anecdotal evidence that we have, that I know I hear all of the time, this is an area of huge concern.
Okay. Based on that topic being put forward, would anybody have an issue with us or discussion around submitting that as a possible topic that we put forward to the Auditor General? Sid?
And Carla, just be clear, is it that, like, that exact request, is that what it's on? Like, it's huge, you know, do you know what I mean? Like, is it for the AG to look into that specific area?
Well, yeah, just to ensure that the government and the Mental Health Review Board are achieving their mandate. Because looking at these numbers would, and based, you know, that information is out of date, there's not proper contact information, I think that there's, if we were to look at that, just to ensure that they are meeting their mandate and using these numbers as a reason why this is concerning.
Sid?
Yeah, no, thank you. I was just curious, I was just quickly trying to look it up because I know it's been some time since the AG has delved into mental health. I think it was 2014 or something like that. So yeah, I would support that.
Okay. Everybody else? Any comments? Okay. So we will, and Carl, you have something written there that we can give to Ryan around what it is specifically. So Ryan, Carl can provide you with that document she's got. Does anybody else have any items that they'd like to bring forward? No? Okay. I would suggest that that be something, I don't think the Auditor General, correct me if I'm wrong, gave us a timeline in which we had to submit items. So would that could be something that we discuss, you know, on kind of maybe a regular basis where we talk about it during our planning meeting if there's anything that's come up. I don't think that there was this is a one-time only offer. Would you guys be open to putting this as one of our planning initiatives, that if anybody has an item that they'd like to bring forward to see the Auditor General review, then we can bring that forward? Would you be open to that? Yes, okay. That's it.
Thank you, Chair. Do you mean like a part of every meeting where we just suggest things to the Auditor General, or is it, you mean like part of our planning meeting after this House session? Because I don't know if our committee just needs to come up with things every meeting just to get the, as the AG said, he said, they've got a list, they're going through things, but they'll always welcome input. I mean, any one of us can email at any time, but I appreciate the offer from the office. Maybe there's a weighted thing. If the public can't think of it together. I don't know. I guess a clarification. Do you mean every meeting, or do you mean in our planning meeting after the House session?
I'm thinking planning meetings, Sid. Like even if it's twice a year, maybe we kind of look at compiling and doing. If maybe there's nothing on that we would want to put forward, or maybe there's 3 topics that come forward and we wait and do a submission or whatever after we do a planning session. So I would think compiling it, not inundating them. Yeah, that's
I'm
what I
good
was
with that.
thinking. Okay, great, thank you. The next was advice on making annual reports more relevant and public accounts more understandable. Do we have any thoughts on that? Just in general, yeah. No suggestions on that one? Okay. Carla?
Just a little comment. I think that kind of the fact that we were kind of hammering down on annual reports, that they started to flow in. So I really see the value in us really driving that because it's important. And so I think that I see kind of as a step, and we see how this kind of keeps going. And I think that in turn, maybe those things. I know public accounts being more understandable, I have nothing to add to that at the moment because I don't, how do you, it's challenging to, there's almost needs to be like an education piece, like what is public accounts exactly and what sorts of things do you look at? Because as a member, it's something that I'm learning all the time. So I really appreciate that conversation. We'll have to think on that one.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay. Just to touch on the annual reports, and let's go to new business, or to review of the correspondence. If anybody, if we're complete on number 5, and that we'll just put that one submission in, and that we don't have any advice on making the annual reports relevant, we'll move on to number 6, which is review of correspondence. So we have a number of letters that have come in. We have a letter from Cindy Harris, the Secretary to Treasury Board, and she gave us an update on where they are on the implementation of the Auditor General's 2020 recommendations on the IT security access codes. Have the members had a chance to review that? And is there anything, any decisions or new business that you would like to identify? Any questions or thoughts that you'd like to bring forward on that? They say that they're at 39% of the Auditor General's recommendations, and all other recommendations are currently in progress, and we anticipate additional completions before the calendar year end. Carla?
Additional completions. So would it be worth asking them for a timeline, or which ones they've prioritized? I don't know.
Yeah, this is the one where there was, you might recall, there was a lot of items within their recommendations that we reviewed in camera based on the sensitivity of the information. Ryan, this one would be based on your new responsibilities with the public accounts, in that looking at what the departments are doing to complete recommendations. Would this be something that would fall under that that responsibility, where you'd look at what their action plan is in order to accomplish the AG recommendations? Would this be something that would fall under that piece?
I would say it would, but again, it comes up against that in-camera consideration that this is very sensitive material. And
Yeah.
The committee did get a detailed review of what they would be doing in the findings of the Auditor General. So I'm not sure what further I could provide in that regard.
Okay. Any discussion on this one? Carlos suggested asking for more of a timeline, like would you like or would they say end of the calendar year that they would have an update?
Yeah.
Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Is everybody else okay with that? Sydney?
So this was from the 2020 report, right?
Yes.
And so during COVID and creating 2 budgets, they got to 39% of the recommendations completed. So we're going to email them again and just say, what's the exact ask again?
We weren't going to ask for anything further.
Oh, I thought you said we were going to send it.
No, Carla suggested, but then I just asked her, are you okay, as the letter indicates that they would have more complete by the end of the calendar
Okay,
year
good. Perfect.
if we just leave it.
I'm good then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay? So if no further discussion on that one, the next one is, the next letter is from Bob Creed, and it's in response to our inquiry about the annual reports. So this one provides information that, please note, you will find the activities of the marine and fisheries aquaculture. This was one of the confusing ones, right, Ryan, where because of the change of the departments, some things were possibly missed or anyway, so the Departments of Agriculture and Land, Environment, Water, and Climate Change and Fisheries and Communities are working together to create an annual report for the former Department of Communities, Land, Environment. This work will be prioritized and documents tabled as quickly as possible. So any thoughts on that, or are we okay to wait for their submission? Okay. The next one is from Karen McDonald, and that is in response to the committee's inquiry about the annual report. And this one is about the annual report for the Department of Justice and Public Safety to and including 2017-2018. The 2018-2019 is still outstanding, and basically they're saying, I can confirm that it'll be ready for tabling during the upcoming legislative assembly, so we can expect to see that shortly. Any other further discussion on that? Okay. Ron Waite of the Canadian Area Development Corporation, in response to our our letter. What did I say? Oh, excuse me. The Charlottetown Area Development Corporation. It says, I'm just going to jump, upon investigation, it was determined that the annual report was prepared, but because of an administrative oversight, a copy of the final report was not sent to the minister's office for tabling. And that was the 2018-2019 financial year. So in following up on the administrative procedures that led to this failure, it was discovered that CADC has not tabled annual reports since 2016, due mainly to staffing changes resulting in replacement staff not being properly trained on all job-related procedures, a situation that has been corrected. On January 29, 2021, CADC delivered all copies of the CADC annual reports from 2016 to 2020 to the minister's office so that he can table the reports. So I think that's great progress. And then, what's that? Yeah, I know, right? And then we have a list of letters that have been sent out. We've sent out to Brian Matheson, Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Land, to Bethany McLeod, DM of Education and Lifelong Learning, and Bob Creed, and those letters are attached. So based on that correspondence, is there any discussion? I would say I would agree with Carla on our oversight on the annual reports. I think has been very beneficial in order to shed light on that. Many of them were outstanding, and I'd just like to thank all the departments and the responses, because we've seen a lot of annual reports come in very short order, and I know that takes a lot of effort and a lot of work, and so I would just like to express my gratitude to see so much movement in that. I think it's been really great. Sid?
Just a comment on that too. I know I've spoken to a few ministers just in passing about it, and I think they're good on their current ones, but when they take over the portfolio after the past election and they're looking back, a lot of the departments, as we've seen in some of the letters, because they're mixed now, it's pulling different things from different ones before. So I know anecdotally that there's an effort. It's just it's tricky to pull them all, but they are trying to update them all. So that was good to hear. It's good.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Yeah, excellent. And that would be just one of the unintended impacts that you would see, right? Like when you realign departments, that would be an unintended impact for sure. So anyway, that's great. Thanks for the feedback, Sid. So if no further correspondence, then we'll move to number 7, new business. Does anybody have any new business that they'd like to bring forward? No? Okay. And with that, we'll move to an adjournment, and I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. Carla, thanks everyone. Have a great day.